So, I've mentioned a couple times before in the past that Formula 1 had failed to stage a race in New York City, and aside from the fact that the more concrete of these attempts would actually take place in New Jersey, another instance where Formula 1 almost hit the Big Apple was in 1983. This would have meant, among other things, that there would have been 3 American Grand Prix on the calendar. Good commercially, but not really branching out as a worldwide sport now, aren't we? However, while New York was on the provisional calendar for 1983, it would later get nerfed. But something interesting to note is that it wasn't the only track to get the boot from the schedule that year. You see, the calendar that we ended up with was a little bit different from the one that we got provisionally. One change that was made was the replacement of the New York Grand Prix with a race at Brands Hatch. And elsewhere in August, the Grand Prix circus was initially touted to race in a new European territory, more specifically in the Soviet Union. Yaha, that place. Home of borscht, potatoes, and wait, hang on, what? How? And what happened to it? How did Formula 1 come so close to having a race in the Soviet Union? And why did it fall apart? Okay, so a little bit of a backstory here for any of you not aware of the significance of this. The Soviet Union can best be described in the 3 following terms: poverty, the KGB, and making things better than the West. At least that was their mindset. I mean, this was the state that made the Tsar Bomber, simply to tell the US that they made a bigger bomb. But I mean, hey, this is getting a little bit off topic, I suppose. Travel within the region was restricted, and outsiders were not all that trusted. I mean, this is a very simplified account of it all, but that's not what this channel or this video is about, so I'm just gonna move on. Anyway, the first attempt, if you can call this one an attempt, at bringing a race to the Soviet Union was back in 1964, when the delegation of the Russian Autosport Federation paid visit to Silverstone. They were intrigued and ultimately inspired to have a circuit of their own. Plans were put forward for a brand new facility in Moscow, on the floodlands of the Skodnya River in Tushno, and it was certainly ambitious. More than 20 designs for the circuit were drafted, although this was ultimately what they settled on. The grandstands would have been able to hold 150,000 people. There were plans for a hotel near the circuit, and everything else required to host a Formula 1 event was also taken into consideration. But ultimately, such a project was ruled to be too expensive, with a price tag of 40 million rubles. And so any plans for a race in the Soviet Union were now dead in the water, something not totally uncommon in the region at the time. But a couple decades later, the yearn to bring a race to the Soviet Union was reinvigorated, thanks to F1 Supremo Bernie Ecclestone, and a man whose passion for cars was as big as his eyebrows. Entering in is Leonid Brezhnev. By 1982, this man was the face of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was a bit of a car nut, with a passion for driving foreign cars that were gifted to him from other nations. He wasn't particularly law-abiding on the road, or off of it. Nonetheless, this love of the automobile was most probably what prompted Bernie Ecclestone to send him a letter in June of 1982. Bernie tried to pitch to Brezhnev that Formula 1 was a global sport akin to that of the Olympics, touting massive viewership figures, and about how the technologically and economically advanced countries all have Grand Prix of their own, and that those damned Americans, well, they've got 3. It was a bit of a hard sell on the technology aspect, and did seem to bank on the Soviets' obsession with bettering the West. He also planned to cover the cost of the Grand Prix, and given how he owned the Brabham team, would have allowed for a Soviet driver to partake in the inaugural Grand Prix in one of his cars. A provisional date in August was penciled in, and a location was scouted in Moscow with a track design that looked like this. Actually, this isn't it. I just outlined Mikhail Gorbachev's birthmark. Still though, it does kind of look like something Herman Tilke would design nowadays, doesn't it? However, the real proposed circuit was rumored to have reached 14 kilometers in length. Wait, what? But despite Bernie's promising of covering the cost of the Grand Prix, financial issues were still at play. The potential cost of the Grand Prix was decidedly unhealthy for Brezhnev, who died of a heart attack in November of 1982. With Brezhnev's death also went any hope of a Soviet Grand Prix, and the race was removed from the final calendar of 1983. There was no desire for a race to take place in the Soviet Union. They probably clued into the fact that Formula 1 was a sport for the capitalist swine, and so did Bernie and his cronies. They said nyet. Although when it comes to hosting a Grand Prix behind the Iron Curtain, this was achieved in 1986 with the Hungarian Grand Prix. So Bernie still achieved his lifelong dream of selling Marlboro hats to communists. When the Soviet Union fell apart like Bottas's championship hopes after round 4, there were renewed talks to host a race within Russia. Eventually, we ended up with a race on the Sochi Autodrome, racing around the grounds that hosted the 2014 Winter Olympics. But while extending its reach to many corners of the globe is a good thing for Formula 1, this track is hardly what you call a crowd pleaser. I have an idea for how to improve it, but it may mean borrowing that Tsar Bomber from earlier. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Drop a comment below, subscribe to the channel if you're awesome, and always remember, keep it respectful, be wholesome, don't be a menace, and as always, I'll see you all later.